The clock on the dashboard of Arthur Vance's modest sedan read 2:14 p.m. Wednesday. The sun, a pale disk in the hazy autumn sky, cast long, weary shadows across the manicured lawns of the suburban street. His street. He had come home early, a rare indulgence. The final schematics for the riverfront revitalization project had been approved by the city council that morning, a full 2 days ahead of schedule. It was a victory, a quiet one, the kind Arthur specialized in. He had expected to walk into an empty house, to enjoy the profound silence of a home in the middle of a weekday, a silence that was his alone. But the house was not empty. Parked in the driveway, gleaming under the weak sun, was Clara's silver sedan. It was a statement piece, a birthday gift from her father 2 years ago, a car that cost more than Arthur's entire annual declared income. It was her symbol of a life she felt she was still owed, a life Arthur was, in her family's estimation, failing to provide. And it was supposed to be in the parking garage of her downtown office building, where she worked as a marketing director for a high-end fashion brand. A cold knot, familiar and heavy, settled in Arthur's stomach. It wasn't the sharp pang of shock. It was the dull, leaden ache of confirmation. He had suspected, not of this specific transgression, but of the 1,000 tiny fissures that had fractured their marriage into a mosaic of polite fictions. He pulled his own car to the curb, the engine idling with a soft hum. He looked at the house, a handsome colonial they had bought with a significant contribution from her father. A point of leverage Richard Sterling never let Arthur forget. It was Clara's dream house. For Arthur, it had become a beautifully appointed prison of unmet expectations. He took out his phone. His thumb hovered over her name. He knew what he was about to do. He was not gathering evidence. He was administering a test, a final one. He pressed the call button and listened to the electronic ring. 1 ring, 2. On the third, she answered, her voice unnaturally bright and slightly breathless. "Arthur, hi! Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine, Clara," he said, his own voice perfectly level, a calm sea over a turbulent depth. "My project wrapped early. I was just calling to see what you felt like for dinner." A fractional pause. In that sliver of silence, he could almost hear the frantic whirring of her mind, the search for the right thread in a tapestry of lies. "Oh, that's great news about the project, honey. Dinner." Another breath, this one more audible, as if she'd just run up a flight of stairs. "Well, I'm absolutely swamped. We have the new campaign launch, and I'm in back-to-back meetings. I'll probably be here until 8 or 9. I'll just grab something on the way home. You should get something for yourself." The lie was so blatant, so carelessly constructed, it was more than a deception. It was an insult. It was a testament to how little she thought of him, how low her estimation of his intelligence and awareness had fallen. He was looking directly at her car, the sun glinting off the windshield, and she was telling him she was 12 miles away, trapped in a conference room. "All right, Clara," he said softly. "Work hard. We'll talk later." "Okay, love you," she chirped, the words hollow and automatic. "Goodbye," Arthur replied, and ended the call. He sat for a long moment, the phone resting in his hand. The quiet of the car was absolute. He felt a profound sense of clarity, the kind that comes when a fog of hope finally burns away, revealing the stark and unforgiving landscape of reality. He wasn't angry. Anger was a hot, chaotic emotion. This was cold. This was methodical. This was the feeling a chess master gets when his opponent makes a fatal, predictable move. The game was now his to control. Have you ever felt that cold certainty when a lie is told so poorly, it's an insult to your intelligence? When you know with absolute clarity that a line has been crossed and nothing will ever be the same. If you have, do me a favor and hit that like button. It helps to know you're not alone. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I have a feeling this is a story that crosses all borders. You are not going to want to miss What happens when a patient man finally decides he has been patient long enough? Arthur put the car in park and turned off the engine. He got out, the click of the door echoing in the suburban stillness. He didn't look at Clara's car again. He didn't need to. He walked up the stone pathway, his posture erect, his shoulders back. In his right hand, he carried a simple, well-worn leather portfolio. It was unassuming, almost anachronistic in an age of tablets and smartphones. To his wife's family, it was another symbol of his smallness, the mark of a man who dealt in paper and blueprints, not power and capital. They had no idea what it truly contained. His key slid into the lock without a sound. He turned it, the deadbolt retracting with a soft snick. He pushed the door open and stepped into the cool, silent foyer of the house. It was immaculate, a showroom of neutral tones and expensive, impersonal furniture. Clara's taste. He stood there, listening, and then he heard it. Not from the living room or the kitchen, it was from upstairs. A muffled laugh, quickly suppressed. It was a man's laugh, and it was coming from their bedroom. Arthur's face remained a mask of calm composure. He did not go upstairs. He turned to his left and walked into his office, closing the door quietly behind him. The game had begun. The memory surfaced, unbidden but sharp, as he sat in the leather chair behind his desk. It was from 6 months prior, a Sunday dinner at the Sterling estate. The air in their cavernous dining room was always thick with the scent of lemon polish, old money, and unspoken condescension. Richard Sterling, Clara's father, sat at the head of the long mahogany table, a modern-day king in his bespoke suit, holding court. He was a man built of broad pronouncements and unshakable self-regard. "The market is about consolidation, Arthur," Richard had boomed, gesturing with a heavy silver fork. "The small players, the boutique firms, they're being swallowed whole. It's a jungle. You have to be a lion, or you're meat." He took a sip of his wine, a Bordeaux that cost more per bottle than Arthur's weekly grocery bill. His gaze, heavy with judgment, settled on his son-in-law. "Which brings me to you. How are those little projects of yours coming along? Still drawing pretty pictures of libraries and community centers?" The table fell quiet. Clara's mother, Eleanor, a woman whose spine seemed to be forged from frozen pearls, gave a tight, sympathetic smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Richard, don't be coarse," she murmured, a performance of defending Arthur that only served to highlight the attack. No, I'm genuinely curious," Richard insisted, leaning forward. "I'm trying to understand your business model. Is there even a model? Or is it more of a hobby that pays for itself?" "Sometimes." Arthur had felt the familiar heat of humiliation prickle at his neck. He looked across the table at Clara. She was meticulously cutting her filet mignon, her eyes fixed on her plate, her jaw set. She was a statue of willful ignorance. Her silence was not neutrality. It was complicity. It was a vote cast in her father's favor. In that moment, her refusal to meet his gaze was a deeper wound than any of her father's verbal blows. She was his wife. She was supposed to be his partner, his defender. Instead, she was a silent enabler, a spectator at his own ritualistic humbling. He had placed his napkin on the table, his movements deliberate. "The projects are proceeding well, thank you, Richard," Arthur said, his voice even and calm. He did not rise to the bait. He did not defend his work, his income, or his worth. To do so would be to accept the premise of their judgment, to grant them the authority to assess him. "The public library expansion is fully funded and on schedule. We're breaking ground next month." "Public funding," Richard scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "That's not business, Arthur. That's charity with paperwork. You can't build an empire on goodwill." "I'm not trying to build an empire," Arthur replied softly. "I'm trying to build a library." The simplicity of the statement hung in the air, a quiet rebuke that Richard was too arrogant to comprehend. He saw it as weakness, a lack of ambition. He laughed, a short barking sound. Well, every king needs a court jester, I suppose. Just make sure my daughter has everything she needs. That's all I ask. The threat was veiled, but clear. You are living on my charity. You are here at my pleasure. Eleanor chimed in then, her voice like chimes of ice. We do worry, Arthur. Clara is used to a certain standard of living. It must be a challenge managing on a variable income. Managing. The word was chosen with surgical precision. It painted a picture of Clara as a long-suffering martyr, bravely making do with the pittance her husband provided. It erased the fact that Arthur's variable income had consistently covered every one of their shared expenses, freeing up Clara's substantial salary for her own discretionary spending. The designer clothes, the spa days, the silver sedan her father had bought her as a pointed reminder of what real money looked like. Through it all, Arthur remained placid. His gaze was steady, his hands resting in his lap. Beside his chair on the floor sat his simple leather portfolio. He had reached down and his fingers had brushed against the worn grain of the leather, a silent, grounding touch. It was his anchor in this sea of contempt. Inside that portfolio were not just architectural drawings. Inside it was the truth. Inside it was the patiently gathered architecture of their eventual ruin. They saw a man sketching buildings. They had no idea he was, in fact, the architect of a reckoning they could not even imagine. He looked at Clara, still staring at her plate, and he knew that when the storm came, she would not be spared the rain. She had chosen her side, not with words, but with the deafening power of her silence. That dinner had not been an insult. It had been a clarification. It had set the final cornerstone for the edifice of justice he was now, finally, ready to build. Back in the present, in the quiet solitude of his office, Arthur closed his eyes for a moment. The memory faded, but the cold resolve it had forged remained. He had not gone upstairs to confront Clara and her guest. A messy, emotional confrontation was their arena, not his. It would devolve into shouting, tears, and accusations, a chaotic storm in which truth would be the first casualty. His methods were different. He did not rage. He executed. He opened his laptop. The screen glowed to life, not with architectural CAD software, but with the dense, flickering data of global finance. Encrypted communication platforms, proprietary analytics dashboards, and secure servers linked to Geneva, London, and Hong Kong. This was his true office. The drafting table in the corner was a prop. The blueprints for the community center were a costume. The world knew Arthur Vance, if it knew him at all, as a moderately successful freelance architect with a penchant for pro bono public works. A good man, a quiet man, a man of no particular significance in a world that measured significance in billions. This perception was his most valuable asset. In reality, Arthur Vance was the sole, anonymous principal of Aethelred Capital. The name was a private joke, a nod to an Anglo-Saxon king known as the Unready, whose reign was marked by poor advice and a failure to prepare for crisis. Arthur, by contrast, was always ready. Aethelred was a ghost, a private equity leviathan with no public face, no headquarters, no corporate profile. It existed only as a network of holding companies, trusts, and legal proxies, a financial instrument of immense power and precision that Arthur wielded from this small, quiet room. He specialized in silent, strategic acquisitions of undervalued or mismanaged assets, restructuring them and multiplying their value, all without ever leaving a fingerprint. His net worth wasn't measured in the millions his in-laws condescendingly alluded to. It was a staggering figure that would render them speechless. He navigated to a secure folder on his server. The folder was labeled with a single, elegant word: Sterling. He clicked it open. For 5 years, ever since Richard's condescension had curdled from casual disdain into a consistent, targeted campaign of humiliation, Arthur had been studying Sterling Holdings. He had not done it out of spite, not at first. He had done it as a strategist studies his opponent. He had analyzed its every quarterly report, its supply chains, its debt covenants, its executive culture. He knew its strengths, and more importantly, he knew its hidden, fatal weaknesses. Richard Sterling had built his empire on commercial real estate, but he had done so with reckless aggression. He had expanded too quickly, borrowing heavily against his existing properties to fund new, speculative ventures. His entire company was a magnificent glass house, built on a foundation of immense leverage. It was profitable, for now, but it was profoundly vulnerable. A significant shift in interest rates, a downturn in the commercial leasing market, or a loss of a key client could bring the entire structure crashing down. Arthur's screen displayed a complex diagram of interconnected corporate entities. For the past 18 months, Ethelred Capital, through a series of shell corporations, had been quietly buying up the debt of Sterling Holdings. They had purchased it from banks and other financial institutions who were growing nervous about Richard's high-risk strategy. He now owned a controlling interest in the financial paper that kept his father-in-law's company afloat. Richard Sterling thought he was the master of his own destiny. In reality, he was a tenant in a building Arthur now owned. But that was only the first part of the plan. The second part was now in motion. Arthur opened another file. It was a prospectus for a company called Northlight Logistics, a mid-sized distribution and warehousing firm that was the linchpin of the entire regional supply chain. Northlight was Sterling Holdings' single largest and most important tenant, occupying nearly 40% of their total commercial square footage. Losing them would be catastrophic. For the last 3 months, Richard had been in a state of high excitement, boasting to anyone who would listen that he was on the verge of acquiring Northlight himself. He saw it as his masterstroke, a move that would vertically integrate his business and secure his legacy. He had put together a massive, highly leveraged offer to buy the company. Arthur smiled, a thin, mirthless expression. He knew all about the offer. He had been tracking it for weeks. What Richard didn't know was that the quiet, family-owned board of Northlight Logistics had been deeply unnerved by his aggressive, debt-fueled tactics. They didn't want to be acquired by a man like Richard Sterling. So, 3 weeks ago, they had reached out through a trusted intermediary looking for a white knight. That intermediary had, of course, led them to a proxy for Ethelred Capital. The final documents had been signed that morning, just an hour before Arthur's project at the city council had been approved. While Arthur was shaking hands with the planning commissioner, his lawyers in Zurich were finalizing the transaction. Ethelred Capital, and by extension Arthur Vance, was now the silent, sole owner of Northlight Logistics. Richard Sterling was about to throw a lavish party to celebrate a victory he believed was imminent. He was planning to announce his successful acquisition of the company that Arthur now owned. And he was leveraging his own company to the hilt to pay for a deal that would never happen. The trap was set. All Arthur had to do was let his father-in-law walk into it. The muffled laughter from upstairs was no longer an insult. It was a soundtrack to a tragedy of which he was the sole author. The days that followed were a masterclass in self-control. Arthur moved through his life with the same quiet dignity he had always projected. He and Clara coexisted in the house like two polite ghosts haunting the same space. He never mentioned the silver sedan in the driveway, the muffled laughter, or the lies she had told him over the phone. He gave her the one thing she did not deserve, normalcy, and it unnerved her. She would watch him across the dinner table, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and suspicion. He would simply eat his meal, asking about her day with a placid interest that was more unsettling than any accusation. His lack of anger was a void she couldn't comprehend, and she kept trying to fill it with nervous chatter. "Dad is just over the moon," she said one evening, 2 days after the incident. "This Northlight deal is everything he's worked for. He's finally going to get the respect he deserves." Arthur looked up from his plate. "I thought he already had respect." You know what I mean, she said, flustered. Industry respect. National. This puts him in a different league. She paused, then added, he's planning a little get-together on Saturday to celebrate. At the house. Just family. He's expecting us to be there, of course. Of course, Arthur said, his voice neutral. A celebration. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. Richard was throwing a party for his own execution. The next day, Arthur ran into Clara's younger brother, Julian, at a downtown coffee shop. Julian was a younger, cruder version of his father, all of the arrogance with none of the charm. He sauntered over to Arthur's small table, a smirk plastered on his face. "Vance," he said, not as a greeting but as a label. "Grabbing a $5 coffee? Must be a big commission check this week." Arthur looked up from his newspaper. "Julian, good to see you." Yeah, Julian waved a dismissive hand. He was dressed in a suit that was too tight and too shiny, the uniform of a man trying desperately to look powerful. "Listen, I saw your car parked outside. Seriously? A 10-year-old sedan? You're married to my sister. Don't you have any sense of shame?" This was their way, the constant chipping erosion of his dignity. They believed that by diminishing him, they elevated themselves. It was the brutish logic of the insecure. "It's a reliable car, Julian. It gets me where I need to go," Arthur replied, his calm a stark contrast to Julian's agitated energy. "That's not the point," Julian hissed, leaning closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper laced with contempt. "The point is appearances. Dad is closing the biggest deal of his life. He's about to be on the cover of Forbes, and his son-in-law drives a beater. It's embarrassing. For Clara, for all of us." Arthur folded his newspaper neatly and placed it on the table. He looked directly into Julian's eyes. "Is your father's success so fragile that it can be threatened by my choice of automobile?" The question, delivered without heat, seemed to momentarily short-circuit Julian's brain. He blinked, his mouth opening and closing silently. He was used to arguments or sullen silence, not calm, incisive logic. You just don't get it, do you?" he finally stammered, falling back on his usual script. "You live in your little world of blueprints and budgets for homeless shelters. This is the real world. Big money, big moves. Dad's acquiring Northlight Logistics. You probably don't even know what that is." "I have some idea," Arthur said, a masterpiece of understatement. "Yeah, well, it's a game changer," Julian puffed out his chest. "We're talking about a 9-figure deal. The banks are all lined up. The board is ready to sign. By this time next week, Sterling Holdings is going to be a dynasty." Arthur took a slow sip of his coffee. He could have ended it right there. One sentence, one quiet revelation would have shattered Julian's smug world into a million pieces. "I own Northlight Logistics." But the timing was wrong. A private humiliation for Julian was not the goal. The lesson needed to be delivered to the entire family, in the very heart of their kingdom, at the moment of their greatest pride. Justice, like architecture, required a solid foundation and a carefully constructed sequence. This was merely the laying of another stone. "I wish him all the best," Arthur said, his voice imbued with a sincerity that was, in its own way, the cruelest deception of all. Julian smirked, believing he had won the exchange. "Right. Well, try to at least get your car washed before the party on Saturday, huh? Don't want you leaking oil on the new paving stones." He sauntered away, swaggering with the confidence of a man who believed he was an integral part of a rising empire, utterly oblivious to the fact that he was standing on a trapdoor, and Arthur's hand was on the lever. Arthur watched him go, a flicker of something almost like pity in his eyes. Almost. He picked up his worn leather portfolio from the seat beside him. He ran his hand over the familiar grain. Everything was in place. Every document, every signature, every piece of the mosaic. The structure was complete. All that was left was the reveal. Saturday arrived, draped in the crisp, brilliant blue of a perfect autumn day. The air was cool, carrying the faint, sweet scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves. It felt like a day for endings and beginnings. Arthur stood before the full-length mirror in his bedroom. He was dressed in a simple, perfectly tailored navy suit. It was not flashy, but the quality of the fabric and the precision of the cut spoke of a quiet, confident elegance. It was a suit they had never seen before. Clara came into the room, already dressed. She wore a stunning emerald green dress, a celebratory color. But her face was a canvas of anxiety. She had been on edge all week, her guilt making her jumpy and irritable. His calm was a mirror she could not bear to look into. "Are you ready?" she asked, fussing with an earring. "We can't be late. Dad wants to make his announcement at 7 o'clock sharp." "I'm ready," Arthur said. He turned from the mirror, his gaze meeting hers. For the first time all week, he let a fraction of the ice in his veins show in his eyes. She flinched, taking a small, involuntary step back. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Everything is exactly as it should be," he said. He walked to the closet and retrieved his leather portfolio. He held it in his left hand, his fingers curled around the worn handle. She eyed the portfolio with a familiar flicker of disdain. "Are you really bringing that to a party?" "It has some papers I might need," he replied smoothly. The drive to her parents' estate was tense and silent. Clara stared out the window, chewing on her lower lip. Arthur drove with a steady hand, his mind a quiet, focused engine of calculation. He felt a profound sense of gravity, the weight of the moment that was to come. This was not just about a business transaction. It was not about revenge, not in its petty, vindictive sense. It was about balance. It was about restoring a natural order that their arrogance had so grotesquely distorted. It was about truth. They pulled up the long, winding driveway of the Sterling estate. The house was ablaze with lights, a beacon of self-congratulation against the darkening sky. Valets in crisp uniforms were directing a parade of luxury cars. Arthur pulled his modest sedan into a space a valet indicated, next to a gleaming black Bentley. The contrast was stark, and he knew it was being noted by the arriving guests, friends of the family, business associates, the courtiers of King Richard's kingdom. As they walked toward the grand entrance, Julian met them on the steps. "There you are, and you brought the briefcase," he said with a loud laugh, gesturing at Arthur's portfolio. "What's in there, Vance? The plans for a new dog park?" A few nearby guests chuckled. Arthur simply smiled. "Something like that." They entered the house. The party was in full swing. A string quartet played softly in the corner. Waiters circulated with trays of champagne and elaborate canapes. At the center of it all was Richard Sterling, his face flushed with victory and expensive scotch. He was surrounded by a circle of admirers, his voice booming across the chatter. Arthur took a glass of champagne from a passing tray. He did not drink it. He simply held it, the cool glass a focal point in the warm, crowded room. He watched Richard, saw the absolute confidence, the unshakable belief in his own dominance. He saw Eleanor, gliding through the crowd like a queen, accepting congratulations on her husband's behalf. He saw Julian, preening and posturing for a group of younger guests. And he saw Clara, who had immediately gravitated to her family's side, leaving him standing alone near the doorway. She was laughing at something her father said, the tension momentarily gone from her face, replaced by the familiar glow of reflected glory. He felt a sudden, piercing sense of detachment, as if he were watching a play whose script only he had read. He knew every line that was coming. He knew the shocking plot twist in the final act. The other actors were performing with gusto, blissfully unaware of the tragedy that awaited them. The quiet before the storm. The air was thick with it. The laughter, the music, the clinking of glasses. It was all just the sound of a world holding its breath, waiting for the fall. Arthur took a slow, deep breath of his own. The curtain was about to rise. At precisely 7 o'clock, Richard Sterling tapped a spoon against his crystal glass. The chatter in the grand ballroom slowly subsided. A hush fell over the assembled guests. Richard stood before the large marble fireplace, a triumphant smile etched on his face. Eleanor, Clara, and Julian stood beside him, a royal family posing for an official portrait. "Friends, family," Richard began, his voice resonating with theatrical gravitas. "Thank you all for coming to share this momentous occasion with us." He paused, beaming, soaking in the adulation of the crowd. "For 30 years I have built Sterling Holdings from the ground up. We've had successes, we've faced challenges, but we have always moved forward. Tonight, we take the biggest step forward in our company's history." Arthur stood near the back of the room, still holding his untouched glass of champagne. He watched Clara's face. She was radiant, her eyes shining with pride for her father. She looked for a moment like the woman he had married, before the corrosive acid of her family's ambition had eaten away at her integrity. "As many of you know," Richard continued, "we have been in negotiations to acquire a key strategic asset, a company that will not only secure our market position, but launch us into a new stratosphere of influence and profitability. I am speaking, of course, of Northlight Logistics." A murmur of impressed approval went through the crowd. This was the news they had all come to hear. Julian puffed out his chest, a smug grin on his face. "The negotiations have been spirited," Richard said with a chuckle, as if recalling a particularly enjoyable polo match. "But in the end, our vision, our strength, and our offer were simply too compelling to refuse. And so it is my profound pleasure to announce that as of this coming Monday, Sterling Holdings will be the new owner of Northlight Logistics." The room erupted in applause. People cheered, raising their glasses. Richard took a deep bow, his arms spread wide, the conquering hero. He hugged Eleanor, then Clara, then Julian, a tableau of dynastic success. Arthur remained perfectly still, a lone island of calm in the sea of celebration. As the applause began to die down, Richard caught sight of Arthur at the back of the room. A malicious gleam entered his eye. He wasn't content with his victory. He needed to rub it in the face of the one person who represented everything he disdained. "And I see my son-in-law, Arthur, back there," Richard called out, his voice carrying across the now quiet room. All eyes turned to Arthur. "Arthur, come on up, don't be shy." Clara's smile faltered. She shot a worried glance at Arthur. This was not part of the plan. Arthur's expression did not change. He began to walk forward, his steps measured and unhurried. He moved through the crowd, which parted for him as if he were walking to his own execution. He still held the portfolio in his left hand. When he reached the fireplace, he stopped a few feet from his father-in-law. "Arthur," Richard said, draping a heavy arm over his shoulder. It was a gesture not of affection, but of dominance. "I just wanted to thank you. Publicly." A confused murmur went through the room. "You see," Richard continued, his voice dripping with condescension, "Arthur here is my conscience. He reminds me that while I'm out here building empires, someone has to worry about the little things. The libraries, the community gardens, well, you know." He gestured vaguely, as if Arthur's work was too insignificant to name. The crowd chuckled politely. "He keeps me grounded," Richard said, patting Arthur's shoulder with patronizing force. "He shows me what life is like for the little guy, and it gives me a certain perspective. It reminds me just how good it is to be a lion and not a lamb. Isn't that right, Arthur?" The final insult landed, heavy and public. It was the culmination of years of quiet humiliations, now delivered on the grand stage of Richard's triumph. The verbal chess match had begun, and Richard thought he had already declared checkmate. Arthur slowly, deliberately, shrugged Richard's arm off his shoulder. He took a step back, creating a space between them. The room fell completely silent. The string quartet had stopped playing. "No, Richard," Arthur said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence with chilling precision. That isn't right. Richard's smile tightened. Excuse me? A lion, Arthur continued, his gaze unwavering, is a magnificent creature, powerful, respected, but a true lion doesn't need to constantly remind the other animals that it's a lion. Its presence is enough. A man who has to endlessly boast of his own strength is not a lion. He is just a man, terrified that one day everyone will discover he is small. The air crackled. The statement landed. Simple, devastating. It was the first quiet bomb. Richard's face, which had been flushed with victory, began to pale. He was no longer in control. Now, what is this? Richard blustered, trying to reclaim the stage. What kind of disrespectful nonsense? I believe you were making an announcement, Arthur interrupted smoothly, about your acquisition of Northlight Logistics. I found it particularly interesting, because I'm afraid your information is out of date. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Julian stepped forward. What the hell are you talking about, Vance? The deal is done. Is it? Arthur asked, turning his calm, analytical gaze on Julian. Then you must have the signed purchase agreement. I'd love to see it. Perhaps it's in your briefcase? Oh, wait, that's mine. He lifted the leather portfolio. Arthur, stop this, Clara hissed, her face white with panic and shame. What are you doing? He looked at his wife, and for the first time, she saw the man she had been married to for 7 years. Truly saw him. The humility was a shield, the patience was a weapon, and his eyes, which she had always thought of as simply quiet, were now revealed to be as deep and cold as a winter lake. I'm bringing the truth into the light, Clara, he said softly. It's something this family has avoided for a very long time. He turned back to Richard, whose face was now a mask of confusion and rage. You said your offer was too compelling to refuse, but the Northlight board did, in fact, refuse it. They found your debt leverage strategy to be reckless. They were concerned you would strip their company for assets and destroy a business their family had built over 3 generations. They didn't want a lion, Richard. They wanted a steward. That's a lie, Richard roared, his voice cracking. We had an agreement. You had a preliminary, non-binding letter of intent, Arthur corrected him gently, which the board rejected 3 weeks ago when they entered into exclusive negotiations with another buyer, a private buyer, one who offered them a fair price in cash and guaranteed the long-term integrity of the company and the security of its employees. Richard stared at him, speechless. The entire room was frozen, caught in the grip of a drama far more intense than they had anticipated. That deal, Arthur said, his voice dropping slightly, drawing everyone in, was finalized this morning at 10 a.m. Zurich time. The funds have been transferred. The contracts have been executed. He placed his portfolio on a small nearby table. He opened the clasp with 2 quiet clicks. He reached inside and pulled out a single, bound document. He held it up. This, he said, is the signed and executed purchase agreement. He looked directly at Richard, his eyes void of all emotion, save a chilling certainty. I am the other buyer, Richard. I own Northlight Logistics. The silence that followed was not merely an absence of sound. It was a physical presence, a crushing weight that seemed to suck the very air from the room. The statement hung there, shimmering, impossible, yet undeniably true. Richard Sterling stared, his mouth agape, his face the color of ash. Eleanor had a hand pressed to her chest. Her carefully constructed composure shattering like fine china dropped on a marble floor. Julian just shook his head, a look of utter, uncomprehending disbelief on his face. You? Richard finally whispered, the word a ragged exhalation of breath. That's not possible. You're an architect. You draw pictures of parks. That is what I do, Arthur said calmly. It is not who I am. He gestured with the document. My public work is my passion. My private work is my profession. I am the sole principal of Aethelred Capital, and as of this morning, Aethelred Capital is the parent company of Northlight Logistics, your single largest and most vital tenant. He let that sink in. He was no longer just the man who owned the company Richard had failed to buy. He was the man who held the master lease on nearly half of Richard's commercial real estate empire. He was not an outsider to be mocked. He was effectively Richard's landlord. But the money, Julian stammered, his mind struggling to process the scale of this reversal. A deal that size. You don't have that kind of money. You can't. Arthur gave a small, almost sad smile. You are confusing what I choose to spend with what I am able to spend. You and your father see a 10-year-old sedan and you assume poverty. You fail to understand that a man's worth is not the sum of his possessions. It is the sum of his choices. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the three of them, Richard, Eleanor, and Julian. And you have all made some very poor choices. This was the moment for the list of grievances. He had rehearsed it in his mind 1,000 times, not for his benefit, but for theirs. It was the moral mirror, and he was now going to force them to look into it. For 7 years, he began, his voice still quiet, but now imbued with the weight of steel. I have been a guest in your home and a member of your family, and in all that time, you have never once shown me a shred of genuine respect. You have treated me not as a man, but as a project, a disappointment, a stain on your family's pristine image. He looked at Richard. You, Richard, you have used every family dinner, every holiday, every gathering as an opportunity to belittle my work, question my ambition, and mock my income. You did it publicly, to bolster your own fragile ego. You called my work a hobby. You called me a lamb. You did all this while I was quietly paying for the life your daughter enjoyed, a life you took credit for. He turned to Eleanor. And you, with your quiet, cutting remarks, your feigned concern, worrying about how Clara was managing. You judged me by the car I drove and the labels I didn't wear because you lack the capacity to see the character of a man underneath. You are a high priestess in a church of appearances, and your gospel is empty. His gaze fell on Julian. And you, Julian, you are a cheap copy of your father's worst traits. All of his arrogance, none of his intellect. You mistook my patience for weakness. You thought my silence was fear. You insulted me to my face because you believed I was powerless to respond. You are a bully who has never been challenged, and you have no idea how to function in a world where your family name is not a shield. Finally, his eyes rested on Clara. She was weeping now, silent tears tracking down her face, ruining her makeup. Her perfect emerald dress seemed like a costume for a part she could no longer play. And you, Clara, he said, his voice softening with a deep, profound sorrow. You are the greatest disappointment of all, because you knew my character, you knew my integrity, and you watched them do this, time and time again, and you did nothing. Your silence was a choice. You chose their wealth over my worth. You chose their approval over your husband's dignity. You stood with them, he gestured to her family, and in doing so, you left my side completely. He let the indictment settle. The guests, forgotten, were silent witnesses, their faces a mixture of shock, pity, and a dawning, terrible understanding. Arthur turned his attention back to Richard, who seemed to have aged 10 years in as many minutes. The situation is this, Arthur stated, his tone shifting from moral judgment to clinical fact. You have leveraged Sterling Holdings to the absolute limit to finance your failed bid for Northlight. Your debt-to-equity ratio is, to put it mildly, unsustainable. The banks that hold your paper will learn on Monday morning that your cornerstone tenant is now owned by a private entity with no obligation to continue its leases with you past their current term. In fact, I have a fiduciary duty to my own company to find the most cost-effective logistics solutions available. He let the implication hang in the air. He could pull Northlight out of every Sterling property, and the entire empire would collapse like a house of cards. Your company's stock will be worthless by noon on Monday, Arthur stated flatly. Your lines of credit will be frozen. You will be facing bankruptcy within a week. Richard swayed on his feet. You, you would do that? Ruin me? Ruin your own family? Arthur looked at him with cold clarity. You were never my family, Richard. You were my wife's family. And you have spent years trying to ruin me, not with finance, but with contempt. The difference is my attack is not personal. It is simply business, a consequence, a balancing of the books. He then delivered the final, devastating blow. However, he said, I am also now the primary holder of your company's debt, which means your fate is in my hands. The reversal was complete. The man they had mocked as a powerless lamb now held the lion in a cage of his own making. The king was deposed. The courtiers were stunned into silence. And Arthur Vance, the quiet architect, stood in the ruins of their arrogance, holding the blueprints to their future. The immediate aftermath was chaos, but a quiet, desperate kind. The applause had been replaced by a thick, horrified silence, punctuated by the sound of Clara's weeping. The guests, realizing they were witnessing a private execution, began to discreetly slip away, their faces averted, whispering amongst themselves. They wanted no part of this fallen dynasty. Richard Sterling, his face a ghastly shade of gray, sank into a nearby armchair as if his bones had turned to dust. His bravado, his booming confidence, had evaporated, leaving behind a shrunken, terrified old man. My company, my life's work, he mumbled to himself, staring into the abyss that had just opened at his feet. Eleanor rushed to his side, her own face a mask of frantic denial. Richard, do something. You can't let him do this, she pleaded, her voice a shrill, cracking whisper. But her words were empty. There was nothing he could do. The power had shifted so completely, so absolutely, that they were left with nothing but the wreckage of their pride. Julian, after a moment of stunned paralysis, lunged toward Arthur, his face contorted in a snarl of impotent rage. You son of a bitch, he screamed, his voice raw. You planned this! You planned this all along! Before he could get within 5 feet of Arthur, a calm voice cut through the tension. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Mr. Sterling. A man had stepped forward from the now thin crowd. He was in his late 50s, with graying hair and an impeccably tailored suit that was even finer than Arthur's. He had an air of quiet, unshakable authority. He was Marcus Thorne, Arthur's lead counsel and the public face of the proxies that ran Aethelred Capital. He was the unexpected ally. Julian froze, looking between Arthur and the newcomer. Julian, Marcus said, his tone mild but laced with iron. You are looking at potential charges of securities fraud for misrepresenting the status of your company's acquisition attempt to investors, some of whom I see are in this room. Assaulting Mr. Vance right now would be, to put it mildly, an ill-advised addition to your growing list of legal troubles. Julian's rage collapsed into fear. He stumbled back, his eyes wide, the reality of his predicament finally dawning on him. Arthur paid them no mind. His focus was on Clara. He walked over to where she stood, weeping, a lone figure in her now tragically ironic emerald dress. He stood before her, his expression unreadable. Arthur, please, she sobbed, reaching for his hand. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. No, he said, his voice devoid of accusation, a simple statement of fact. You didn't know the details of my financial life because you never cared enough to ask. You never saw me. You saw a reflection of your own fears, a fear of not having enough, a fear of what your parents would think. But you knew what was right, Clara. You knew that a wife stands by her husband. You knew that loyalty and respect are the foundations of a marriage, and you chose to demolish that foundation, brick by brick, with your silence. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, simple object. A key. It was the key to the front door of their house. Her dream house. "When I came home on Wednesday," he said, his voice dropping so only she could hear, "I knew. I heard the laughter from our bedroom. I didn't need to see his face. The betrayal was enough." Her eyes widened in horror. The blood drained from her face. This was a new, more intimate wound. The public humiliation of her family was one thing. The private knowledge of her infidelity was another. "You have a choice to make, Clara," he continued, his voice calm and steady amidst the ruins of her world. "You can stay here, with them. You can cling to the memory of a name that by Monday will be synonymous with failure and disgrace. You can try to rebuild a life on a foundation of lies and arrogance. Or," he paused, holding her gaze, "you can choose to build a life based on integrity, on truth, on a respect that is earned, not demanded." He did not offer her a path back to him. He did not offer forgiveness. He offered her a choice between two versions of herself. It was a choice she had to make alone. He placed the key on the mantelpiece next to a silver-framed photo of the two of them on their wedding day. They looked so happy, so hopeful. It seemed a lifetime ago. "The house is yours," he said. "The contents, the car your father gave you. I will not be returning. My lawyer will be in touch with yours to arrange the formal separation. What you do next is up to you." With that, he turned his back on her. He turned his back on her family. He looked at Marcus Thorne, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Arthur walked toward the grand entrance, his portfolio still in hand. He did not look back. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room on him, but he felt lighter than he had in years. The burden of their contempt, a weight he had carried for so long, had been lifted. He had not stooped to their level. He had not been cruel for the sake of cruelty. He had simply held up a mirror, and they had been shattered by their own reflection. As he stepped out into the cool, clean night air, he felt the first, cleansing breath of a new life. The architect had finally demolished the prison he had been living in. Now he was free to build again. A month passed. Autumn bled into the gray, stoic mood of early winter. The fallout from Richard Sterling's disastrous party had been swift and brutal, just as Arthur had predicted. The story of the public takedown, whispered by the departing guests, had spread like wildfire through the city's financial and social circles. By Monday morning, when the markets opened, Sterling Holdings was in freefall. Arthur, true to his word, had Marcus Thorne's team initiate proceedings. They didn't dismantle Sterling Holdings with vindictive glee. Instead, they acted with the cold, impersonal efficiency of a surgeon removing a cancer. Aethelred Capital, as the primary debt holder, forced the company into a managed bankruptcy and restructuring. Richard Sterling was removed as CEO, his board was dissolved, and his name was stripped from the letterhead. The empire he had built on ego and debt was gone. Arthur had offered his father-in-law a choice. He could walk away with nothing, or he could accept a position as a regional property manager within the new corporate structure. A salaried employee with no title and no power, reporting to a board that Arthur had appointed. It was a chance to work, to retain a shred of purpose, but it required the one thing Richard had never possessed: humility. After a week of bitter rage and denial, facing the stark reality of complete financial ruin, Richard had accepted. He now managed a portfolio of the very buildings he once owned, a ghost haunting his own legacy. Eleanor did not handle the fall from grace with any semblance of dignity. Her social status had evaporated overnight. The friends who had once flocked to her parties now crossed the street to avoid her. Stripped of her wealth and influence, she was left with nothing but her bitterness. A brittle, lonely woman in a much smaller house, paid for by her husband's new, modest salary. Julian, facing investigation by the SEC and a mountain of personal debt, had fled. Rumor had it he was in some tropical country with no extradition treaty, living off whatever funds he had managed to siphon away before the collapse. His blustering confidence had been a thin veneer over a core of pure cowardice. And Clara. For 2 weeks after the party, she had remained in the big, silent house, a prisoner of her own choices. She had called Arthur once, her voice desperate, pleading for a second chance. He had listened patiently, but his response had been firm. "A second chance is not something I can give you, Clara," he had said, his voice even, without malice. "It's something you have to build for yourself. The person you were, the person who stood by and watched me be diminished, is not someone I can share my life with. If you can become someone else, someone who values integrity above approval, then you will have given yourself a new life. But it won't be with me. That chapter is over." He had been fair in the divorce, more than fair. She was financially secure, but he had given her the one thing she feared most: complete independence. She was no longer Clara Sterling, daughter of a magnate. She was no longer Clara Vance, wife of a quiet architect. She was just Clara, and she had to figure out who that was. The last he heard, she had sold the house, quit her job, and moved away, seeking an anonymity her previous life had never allowed. He hoped, with a genuine but distant sincerity, that she would find peace. Arthur himself had moved into a sleek, minimalist penthouse apartment overlooking the river, the very river whose revitalization project he had designed. His life was simpler now, and infinitely more honest. The mask of the humble architect was gone, but he hadn't replaced it with the ostentatious displays of wealth his former in-laws had favored. He still drove a modest car. He still found his greatest joy in his work, the real work, the work of building things that served a community. Aethelred Capital continued to operate in the shadows, but Arthur had directed a significant portion of its profits into a new philanthropic foundation. It funded scholarships, endowed hospitals, and underwrote the kind of public art and architecture projects he had always championed. He was using his immense power not to build a personal empire, but to enrich the world around him. He had won the war, and he had done so without sacrificing his own principles. He had maintained the moral high ground, proving that true strength wasn't the power to crush others, but the power to build, even in the face of their attempts to tear you down. The resolution was not one of fiery revenge, but of quiet, karmic balance. The scales had been righted. The final scene of this chapter of Arthur's life took place not in a boardroom or a lavish estate, but on a cold, bright Saturday morning at the construction site of the new public library. He stood on the muddy ground, blueprints spread on the hood of his car, discussing a structural detail with the site foreman. He was wearing jeans, work boots, and a warm flannel jacket. He looked content, happy. Marcus Thorne pulled up in a black town car. He got out, looking slightly out of place in his expensive wool overcoat. "Arthur," he said with a warm smile, "I thought I might find you here." "Marcus," Arthur greeted him, shaking his hand. "To what do I owe the pleasure? More corporate dragons to slay?" "No, not today," Marcus said, his eyes twinkling. "Today is about closing a chapter. The Sterling restructuring is complete. The foundation is fully endowed. All the loose ends are tied up." He handed Arthur a folder. "This is the final report. It's done." Arthur took the folder but didn't open it. He looked out at the steel skeleton of the library rising against the winter sky. "Good," he said simply. "Are you sure about this?" Marcus asked, his voice softening. "You could have taken everything. You could have left them with absolutely nothing. Some would say they deserved it." Arthur watched as a crane lifted a massive steel beam into place. He thought of Richard, a diminished man in a cheap suit, walking the grounds of a property he no longer owned. He thought of Clara, somewhere out in the world, trying to build a new identity from scratch. He had not destroyed them. He had simply taken away the false scaffolding of their lives, forcing them to see what, if anything, was left standing underneath. "Justice isn't about punishment, Marcus," Arthur said, his voice quiet but certain. "It's about truth. They are living in the truth now. For the first time in their lives, what they build from it is up to them. He turned to his friend, a genuine smile on his face. I'm more interested in what we can build here. He tapped the blueprints on the hood of his car. The library, a place of knowledge, of community, of quiet strength. It was a monument not to his wealth or power, but to his values. He had shown the world, and himself, that the most powerful man is not the one who makes the most noise, but the one whose foundations are the deepest, whose structures are the soundest, and whose purpose is to build something that will last. In the end, this story is about the quiet, unshakable power of integrity. It's a reminder that true worth isn't measured by the car you drive, the house you live in, or the approval of others. It's measured by your character, your patience, and the dignity you maintain when the world tries to strip it from you. Arthur's victory wasn't in the millions he made or the company he controlled. It was in proving that a good man, armed with the truth, is more powerful than any shallow empire built on arrogance and lies. What do you think? Was Arthur's justice too harsh, or was it exactly what they deserved? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective is what makes this community so special. And if you found some value in this story, please hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of justice and redemption. Thank you for watching. Be well, and remember to build your own life on a foundation of truth.